Judge calls cops on deaf black girl for strange hand signals. But when the truth is revealed, everything changes. The imposing marble facade of the Millbrook County Courthouse loomed against the clear blue sky of a crisp autumn morning. Inside, the air was thick with tension as Judge William Hawthorne prepared to begin another day of juvenile court proceedings. At 62, Judge Hawthorne was a formidable presence on the bench, his silver hair and stern countenance lending gravitas to his already considerable authority. As the bailiff called the court to order, Judge Hawthorne's eyes swept across the room, taking in the usual mix of anxious parents, bored teenagers, and harried lawyers. Today, something caught his attention. In the third row, a young black girl, no more than 14 or 15 years old, was moving her hands in a series of quick, intricate gestures. Judge Hawthorne's brow furrowed. In his 30 years on the bench, he'd seen all manner of disruptive behavior. This was new. Was she making gang signs, trying to communicate with someone in the gallery? His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. "Young lady in the third row," called out, his voice reverberating through the suddenly silent courtroom. "What do you think you're doing?" Girl's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise and a hint of fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, her hands began to move again, more frantically this time. Judge Hawthorne felt his patience wearing thin. "I asked you a question, young lady. Speak up." A woman sitting next to the girl, presumably her mother, leaned in and whispered something in her ear. The girl shook her head vigorously, her hands continuing their mysterious dance. "Your Honor," the mother began, her voice trembling slightly, "my daughter is—" But Judge Hawthorne cut her off with a wave of his hand. "I'm not interested in excuses, ma'am. If your daughter can't behave appropriately in my courtroom, then perhaps she needs to learn a lesson about respect for the law." With that, he turned to the bailiff. "Call the police," he ordered. "I want this girl removed from my courtroom and charged with contempt." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The mother's face crumpled in dismay, while the girl's eyes filled with tears. But still, her hands kept moving, as if she couldn't stop, even if she wanted to. As the bailiff reached for the phone, a young woman in a crisp suit stood up from the front row. "Your Honor," she called out, her voice clear and confident. "If I may approach the bench?" Judge Hawthorne recognized her as Sarah Chen, a newly minted public defender who had been appearing in his courtroom with increasing frequency over the past few months. He admired her dedication, even if he found her idealism somewhat grating at times. "Make it quick, Miss Chen," he grunted, gesturing her forward. As Sarah approached the bench, she glanced back at the girl, whose hands were still moving in those strange patterns. When she turned back to the judge, her expression was a mixture of concern and determination. "Your Honor," she began in a low voice, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. The young lady you've just threatened with arrest, she's deaf. Those hand signals you're seeing, that's American Sign Language. She's not being disrespectful or disruptive. She's simply trying to communicate." Judge Hawthorne felt as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from under him. He looked back at the girl, seeing her now through new eyes. Fear on her face, the desperation in her movements, it all made sense now. A wave of shame washed over him as he realized the gravity of his mistake. I see," he managed to say, his usual confidence shaken. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Miss Chen." Sarah nodded, but she wasn't finished. "Your Honor, if I may, this incident highlights a larger issue. Our court system is woefully unprepared to accommodate individuals with disabilities, particularly those who are deaf or hard of hearing. We need interpreters, we need training for court staff, we need—" Yes, Judge Hawthorne interrupted, feeling overwhelmed. "I understand. We'll look into it. For now, please inform Lady and her mother that no charges will be filed, and extend my apology." As Sarah returned to her seat, Judge Hawthorne found himself unable to focus on the cases before him. His mind kept returning to the girl, to the fear in her eyes when she thought she was about to be arrested, simply for trying to communicate. How many others had he misjudged over the years? How many lives had been affected by his assumptions, biases? The rest of the morning passed in a blur. As soon as the lunch recess was called, Judge Hawthorne retreated to his chambers, closing the door behind him with a heavy sigh. He sank into his leather chair, feeling every one of his 62 years weighing on him. A knock at the door roused him from his thoughts. "Come in," called out, straightening up and trying to compose himself. To his surprise, it was Sarah Chen who entered, determined look on her face. "Your Honor," she began, "I hope I'm not overstepping, but I wanted to follow up on our conversation earlier." Judge Hawthorne gestured for her to take a seat. "Not at all, Miss Chen. In fact, I'm glad you're here. I wanted to thank you for your intervention this morning. You prevented me from making a grave error." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Thank you for being willing to listen, Your Honor. But as I mentioned earlier, this isn't just about one incident. It's about a systemic failure to accommodate and understand individuals with disabilities, particularly in our justice system." Judge Hawthorne nodded slowly. "I'm beginning to see that. What do you propose we do about it?" A spark of excitement lit up Sarah's eyes. "Well, for starters, we need to implement mandatory training for all court staff on disability awareness and accommodation. We need to ensure that certified interpreters are readily available for all court proceedings, and we need to review our policies and procedures to identify and eliminate barriers for individuals with disabilities." As Sarah continued to outline her ideas, Judge Hawthorne found himself both impressed by her passion and overwhelmed by the scope of the changes she was suggesting. It would mean overhauling many of the court's long-standing practices, challenging deeply ingrained attitudes, and likely facing resistance from those who preferred the status quo. But as he thought back to the fear on that young girl's face, he knew he couldn't simply return to business as usual. He had been given a wake-up call, chance to right a wrong, and potentially make a real difference in people's lives. "Miss Chen," he said, interrupting her mid-sentence, "I want you to put together a formal proposal for these changes. Include budget estimates, training plans, everything. I'll present it to the chief judge and the county board myself." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "Really? Thank you, Your Honor. I'll get started right away." As she turned to leave, Judge Hawthorne called out, "And Miss Chen? I'd like to meet with that young lady and her mother, to apologize in person and to learn. Do you think you could arrange that?" Sarah smiled, genuine warmth in her expression. "I think that can be arranged, Your Honor. Thank you for being willing to listen and learn. It's not always easy to admit when we're wrong, especially for those in positions of authority." After Sarah left, Judge Hawthorne sat in silence for a long moment. He thought about the young girl, about all the others who might have passed through his courtroom feeling unheard and misunderstood. He thought about his own biases, the assumptions he'd made throughout his career without even realizing. It was uncomfortable, this process of self-reflection and change. But as he prepared to return to the bench for the afternoon session, Judge Hawthorne felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Hope that he could learn, that he could do better, that he could use his position to effect real change. As he donned his robe and headed back to the courtroom, he made a silent vow. This wouldn't be the end of the story. It would be the beginning of a new chapter. For himself, court, and for all those who sought justice within its wall. The afternoon session was about to begin. For Judge William Hawthorne, a much longer and more profound journey was just getting started. As Judge William Hawthorne sat in his chambers that evening, long after the courthouse had emptied, he found himself lost in thought. The events of the day had shaken him to his core, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and the system he had served for so long. His eyes drifted to the photographs on his desk, snapshots of a life dedicated to the law. There he was, fresh out of law school, eager and idealistic. Another showed him taking the oath as a newly appointed judge, his wife beaming proudly at his side. And there, in a simple silver frame, was a picture of his father, the man who had shaped so much of who William Hawthorne had become. Judge Hawthorne Sr. had been a towering figure in Millbrook County, a judge renowned for his strict interpretation of the law and his no-nonsense approach in the courtroom. Growing up, William had idolized his father, absorbing his views on justice, order, and the proper way to conduct oneself in society. He could still hear his father's voice, clear as if he were in the room. The law is the foundation of civilization, son. Without it, we descend into chaos. It's our job to uphold it, no matter what. Those words had been a guiding principle throughout William's career, but now, for the first time, he found himself questioning whether strict adherence to the letter of the law was always in the best interest of justice. William's thoughts drifted back to his childhood in Millbrook County. It had been a different time, a different world. The civil rights movement was in full swing. But in their small southern town, change came slowly. He remembered the tension in the air, the hushed conversations among adults, the gradual and often reluctant integration of schools and public spaces. His father had prided himself on being colorblind in his rulings, often stating that the law sees no color. But looking back now, William could see the flaws in that thinking. By ignoring the very real disparities and systemic issues faced by people of color, his father's colorblind approach had often perpetuated the very injustices he claimed to prevent. William had followed in his father's footsteps, not just in his career choice, but in his worldview. He had believed that by treating everyone exactly the same, he was being fair and just. But the incident with the young deaf girl forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. Treating everyone the same didn't always mean treating everyone fairly. He thought about his own daughter, Emily, now grown with children of her own. What if it had been her in that courtroom, misunderstood and afraid? The thought made his stomach churn. A knock at the door interrupted his reverie. "Come in," called out, surprised to find anyone still in the building at this hour. It was Martin, courthouse janitor. A kind-faced black man in his late 60s, Martin had been working at the courthouse for as long as William could remember. "Sorry to disturb you, Judge," Martin said, his voice warm and gravelly. "Just doing my rounds. Didn't expect to find anyone here this late." William managed a small smile. "No disturbance, Martin. I was just thinking." Martin nodded sagely, leaning on his mop. "Heard about what happened in court today," he said quietly. "That couldn't have been easy." William looked at Martin, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. How many times had he passed this man in the hallway without really seeing him? How many stories, how many experiences had he missed by not looking beyond the surface? "Martin," William said slowly, "may I ask you something?" "Of course, Judge. In all your years working here, have you ever felt that the court system was unfair? People of color, or people with disabilities, or anyone else?" Martin was quiet for a long moment, expression thoughtful. "Judge, I've seen a lot in my time here. I've seen justice served, and I've seen it miscarried. I've seen people treated fairly, and I've seen folks who never stood a chance. But what I've learned is this: the law might be blind, but the people interpreting it ain't. We all got our biases, our blind spots. The trick is recognizing them and trying to do better." William nodded, absorbing Martin's words. "I'm beginning to see that," he said softly. I don't know where to start." Martin's face softened. "Well, Judge, seems to me you've already started. You're asking questions, you're willing to learn. That's more than a lot of folks ever do." As Martin turned to leave, William called out, "Martin, thank you for your honesty and for everything you do around here." Martin smiled, twinkle in his eye. "Just doing my job, Judge. Same as you." After Martin left, William sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He thought about his father, about the values he'd been raised with, and about the changing world around him. He thought about Martin, about the young deaf girl, about all the people who passed through his courtroom every day. He realized that he had a choice to make. He could continue as he always had, clinging to the beliefs and practices he'd held for decades. Or he could choose to grow, to learn, to adapt to a world that was more complex and diverse than he'd ever fully appreciated. William's eyes fell on a legal pad on his desk. A sudden burst of energy, he picked up a pen and began to write. Ideas for changes in the courtroom, questions he needed to research, people he needed to talk to. It all poured out of him in a rush. As the first light of dawn began to peek through his office window, Judge William Hawthorne set down his pen and looked at the pages of notes before him. It was a start, he knew. A small one, perhaps, but a start nonetheless. He thought about the day ahead, about the young deaf girl and her mother who would be coming to meet with him. For the first time in years, he felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement, prospect of presiding over his courtroom. Today would be different, he vowed. Today he would listen more and assume less. Today he would take the first steps on a journey of learning and growth he knew would last the rest of his career. As he finally rose to head home for a few hours of sleep before court, Judge William Hawthorne felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. The sense that he could make a real difference, not just in upholding the law, but in ensuring true justice for all who entered his courtroom. The journey ahead would be challenging, he knew. There would be resistance, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But as he stepped out into the crisp morning air, William Hawthorne felt ready to face those challenges head-on. The first time in years, he felt like the idealistic young lawyer he'd once been, eager to change the world. Only now, he had the wisdom of experience to guide him, and a newfound understanding of the complexities of true justice. As he drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook County, Judge William Hawthorne made a silent promise to himself. To Martin, to the young deaf girl, and to everyone who would ever stand before him in court, he would do better. He would be better. And in doing so, he would strive to make the justice system better for everyone, one case at a time. Amara Johnson sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers moving deftly as she practiced the new signs she'd learned in her ASL class. 15, she was a study in contrasts. A bright, curious mind trapped in a world of silence. A confident young woman who often felt misunderstood by those around her. As she signed, Amara's mind drifted back to the events in the courthouse. The memory of the judge's stern face, fear she'd felt when she realized he was calling the police. It all came rushing back, making her hands tremble slightly. A gentle touch on her shoulder broke her from her reverie. Amara looked up to see her mother, Anya, standing in the doorway. Anya's eyes were filled with a mixture of love and concern as she signed. "Are you okay, sweetie?" Amara nodded, but her expression betrayed her true feelings. Tanya sat down beside her daughter, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. For a moment, they sat in silence. A concept that held a different meaning in their household. Finally, Amara's hands began to move. "Why did the judge react like that, Mom? I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just trying to tell you I was nervous." Tanya sighed, her own hands moving in response. "Some people don't understand, Amara. They fear what they don't know. But that's not an excuse. What happened was wrong, and we're going to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Amara nodded, but her expression remained troubled. He thought back to when she first lost her hearing, just 3 years ago. It had been sudden, a severe case of meningitis that had left her profoundly deaf. The transition had been difficult, to say the least. She remembered the frustration of trying to communicate, the isolation she felt even among her friends and family. Learning ASL had been a lifeline, opening up a new world of expression and connection. But it had also set her apart, marking her as different in a world that often struggled to accommodate those differences. Amara's hands moved again, faster now as her emotions spilled out. "It's not fair, Mom. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want to be different. Sometimes I just wish." Her hands faltered, but Tanya understood. She pulled her daughter close, her own eyes filling with tears. When she pulled back, her signs were firm and clear. "You are perfect just the way you are, Amara. Never forget that. Your deafness doesn't define you, but it is part of who you are. And that's something to be proud of, not ashamed of." As mother and daughter sat together, Amara's mind wandered to her life before the courthouse incident. She thought about her school, where she was the only deaf student in a mainstream classroom. Most days were a struggle, trying to lip-read her teachers, relying on note-takers, feeling isolated even in a room full of people. But there were bright spots too, like Mr. Gonzalez, her science teacher, who had taken it upon himself to learn basic ASL to better communicate with her. Or her best friend, Zoe, who had enthusiastically learned to sign so they could gossip without anyone overhearing. Amara's hands moved again, slower now. "Do you think things will ever change, Mom? Will people ever really understand?" Tanya's response was immediate and emphatic. "Yes, sweetie. Things are already changing, and we're going to be part of that change." Just then, Amara's younger brother, Marcus, burst into the room. At 10, he was a bundle of energy, his hands flying as he signed excitedly. "Mom, Amara, there's someone here to see you." Tanya and Amara exchanged puzzled glances before heading downstairs. To their surprise, they found Sarah Chen, public defender from the courthouse, standing in their living room. Sarah smiled warmly at Amara, her hands moving in careful if somewhat clumsy, ASL. "Hello, Amara? It's nice to see you again." Amara's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't expected the lawyer to know any sign language. She signed back, her movements slowed to accommodate Sarah's limited knowledge. "It's nice to see you too. What brings you here?" As Tanya interpreted for Sarah, the lawyer's expression grew serious. "I've spoken with Judge Hawthorne," she explained. "He wants to meet with you both, to apologize in person, and to learn more about the challenges you face." Amara felt a mix of emotions at this news: apprehension, hope, and a touch of anger. The judge's words had hurt her deeply, bringing back all the insecurities and frustrations she'd felt since losing her hearing. But the idea that he wanted to learn, to understand, it was more than she had expected. Tanya's hand on her shoulder brought Amara's attention back to the conversation. "What do you think, sweetie? Are you willing to meet with the judge?" Amara took a deep breath, her hands moving decisively as she signed her response. "Yes, I'll meet with him. If there's a chance to make things better, not just for me but for others like me, then I want to take it." Sarah smiled, clearly impressed by Amara's maturity and courage. "That's wonderful, Amara. I think this meeting could be the start of some really important changes in our court system." As Sarah went over the details of the proposed meeting with Tanya, Amara found her mind racing with thoughts of what she would say to the judge. She thought about all the times she'd felt misunderstood or overlooked because of her deafness. She thought about the frustration of trying to navigate a world that wasn't designed with people like her in mind. But she also thought about the people who had made an effort to understand, to learn, to bridge the gap between her silent world and theirs. People like Mr. Gonzalez, like Zoe, and now, perhaps, like Sarah Chen and even Judge Hawthorne. For the first time since the incident in the courthouse, Amara felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was an opportunity to make her voice, silent though it may be, truly heard. As Sarah prepared to leave, she turned to Amara one last time. Her signs were slow and careful, but the message was clear. "You're very brave, Amara. What happened in the courthouse was wrong, but your courage in facing it might just help change things for the better." After Sarah left, Amara retreated to her room, her mind whirling with thoughts of the upcoming meeting. She sat at her desk and began to write, her pen flying across the paper as she poured out her feelings, experiences, her hopes for change. She wrote about the fear she'd felt in the courtroom, the hurt of being misunderstood and judged. But she also wrote about her dreams, a world where being deaf wasn't seen as a deficit, simply as a different way of experiencing life. She wrote about the beauty of ASL, the rich culture of the deaf community that she was still discovering. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across her room, Amara finally set down her pen. She looked at the pages she'd filled, a roadmap of her journey and a manifesto for change. She knew that meeting the judge wouldn't be easy. The memory of his stern face, of the fear she'd felt, was still fresh. But as she looked at the words she'd written, Amara felt a surge of determination. This was her chance to educate, to illuminate, to be a voice for those who, like her, lived in a world of silence but had so much to say. Tomorrow, she would meet the judge, not as a scared girl in a courtroom, but as a young woman with a powerful story to tell and an important message to share. And maybe, just maybe, her words would be the catalyst for real change. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Amara's hands moved in one last, silent affirmation. I am strong. I am proud. I am ready. Officer James Rodriguez sat in his patrol car, parked outside the Millbrook County Courthouse, his mind still reeling from the events that had unfolded earlier that day. At 35, James was a 10-year veteran of the Millbrook Police Department, but nothing in his training had prepared him for the situation he'd encountered in Judge Hawthorne's courtroom. Could still hear the urgency in the dispatcher's voice. Unit 17, we have a 10:15 at the county courthouse. Judge Hawthorne reporting a disruptive individual in his courtroom. Proceed with caution. James had responded immediately, lights flashing as he sped towards the courthouse. A disturbance in Judge Hawthorne's courtroom was virtually unheard of. The judge ran a tight ship, and troublemakers usually knew better than to act up in his presence. But when James had burst into the courtroom, what he found was far from what he'd expected. Instead of a belligerent troublemaker, he saw a young black girl, tears streaming down her face, her hands moving in what he now knew to be sign language. The look of fear in her eyes when she saw him enter. It was an image that would haunt him for a long time to come. Thankfully, the public defender, Sarah Chen, quickly intervened, explaining the situation, before things could escalate further. James had felt a mix of relief and shame as he holstered his weapon and stepped back, realizing how close they'd come to a potentially tragic misunderstanding. Now, as he sat in his patrol car filling out his incident report, James couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental needed to change. It wasn't just about this one incident. It was about a system that seemed ill-equipped to handle the diverse needs of the community it served. A knock on his window startled him from his thoughts. It was his partner, Officer Maria Gonzalez. "Hey, Rodriguez," she said as he rolled down the window. "You okay? You've been sitting here for a while." James sighed, running a hand through his close-cropped hair. "Just thinking about what happened in there, Gonzalez. Could have really messed up today." Maria nodded, her expression somber. "Yeah, I've been thinking about it too. Makes you wonder how many other times something like this might have happened, you know?" James did know. In fact, he'd been grappling with that very question for the past few hours. "Come on," he said, opening his car door. "Let's take a walk. I need to stretch my legs and clear my head." As they strolled around the courthouse square, James and Maria discussed the incident, their training, and the larger implications of what had happened. "You know," Maria said, "in all our training about de-escalation and community policing, I don't remember a single session on interacting with deaf individuals or people with other disabilities." James nodded in agreement. "You're right. We get some basic training on mental health issues, but nothing comprehensive about disabilities, and definitely nothing about sign language or deaf culture." They paused, watching as people went about their daily business in the square, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded in the courthouse earlier. "You think about it," James continued, voice low and thoughtful. "We're called to all sorts of situations every day. How many times might we have misinterpreted someone's actions or behavior simply because we didn't understand their needs or limitations?" Maria's face grew serious. "A scary thought. We're supposed to protect and serve everyone in this community. But how can we do that effectively if we're not equipped to communicate with or understand everyone?" As they continued their walk, James and Maria began to brainstorm ideas. Maybe they could propose additional training for the department. Perhaps they could reach out to local disability advocacy groups for resources and guidance. They even discussed the possibility of learning basic sign language themselves. Their conversation was interrupted by the crackle of their radios. "All units, be advised. Chief Wallace has called an emergency meeting at the station. All officers are required to attend." James and Maria exchanged glances. It wasn't often that the chief called an all-hands meeting, especially not on such short notice. "You think this is about what happened at the courthouse?" Maria asked as they hurried back to their patrol car. James nodded grimly. "I'd bet my next paycheck on it." At the station, the atmosphere was tense. Officers gathered in the briefing room, speculating in hushed tones about the reason for the meeting. When Chief Wallace entered, the room fell silent. "By now, I'm sure you've all heard about the incident at the courthouse today," Chief began, his voice grave. "What happened there was a wake-up call for all of us. We came dangerously close to escalating a situation that never should have been a police matter in the first place." He went on to outline what had happened, praising Officer Rodriguez for his restraint and quick understanding of the situation. He didn't stop there. "This incident has made it clear that we have gaps in our training and our procedures," Chief Wallace continued, "gaps that could lead to tragic misunderstandings and erode the trust between our department and the community we serve." James felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. as the chief announced a series of new initiatives. There would be comprehensive training on interacting with individuals with disabilities, including sessions on basic sign language. The department would be partnering with local advocacy groups to review and improve their policies and procedures. But this isn't just about training, Chief emphasized. This is about changing our mindset, about recognizing that our job isn't just to enforce the law, to serve and protect all members of our community, especially those who are most vulnerable. As the meeting concluded, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. The incident at the courthouse had been a close call, a stark reminder of how easily things could go wrong. But it had also sparked a change, a commitment to do better. Outside the station, James paused to look up at the stars just beginning to appear in the twilight sky. He thought about the young girl in the courtroom, about how scared she must have been. He thought about all the other individuals with disabilities in their community who might have feared interactions with the police. "We're going to do better," he murmured to himself. "We have to." As he headed home, James made a silent promise to himself, to his community, and to that young girl whose bravery had set these changes in motion. He would be part of the solution, part of the change. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone like her encountered the police, the outcome would be very different. The incident at the courthouse had lasted only minutes, but its impact would be felt for years to come. For James Rodriguez and his fellow officers, it was the beginning of a new chapter in their service to the community. One marked by greater understanding, empathy, and true commitment to justice for all. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of the Millbrook County Courthouse, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the polished marble floor. Judge William Hawthorne stood at the window of his chambers, watching as people began to file into the building. Today was no ordinary day. It marked 6 months since the incident that had changed everything. For him, for the court, and for the entire community. A knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. "Come in," called, turning to see Sarah Chen enter, a smile on her face and a thick folder tucked under her arm. "Good morning, Your Honor," she said. "Are you ready for today's ceremony?" Judge Hawthorne nodded, smoothing down his robes. "As ready as I'll ever be, Miss Chen. I just hope we've done enough." Sarah's smile widened. "We've made a good start, Judge. That's what today is all about. Celebrating progress and committing to continued improvement." As they made their way to the main courtroom, Judge Hawthorne reflected on the whirlwind of changes that had swept through the courthouse over the past 6 months. The incident with Amara Johnson had been a catalyst, sparking a series of reforms that had transformed not just the court, but the entire local justice system. The courtroom was packed as they entered. Judge Hawthorne saw familiar faces: court staff, local attorneys, police officers. There were new faces too: members of the deaf community, disability rights advocates, and community leaders who had been instrumental in shaping the new policies and procedures. And there in the front row sat Amara Johnson and her family. The young girl who had once trembled in fear in this very room now sat tall and proud, a small smile playing at her lips as she signed rapidly to her mother. As Judge Hawthorne took his place at the bench, a hush fell over the room. Cleared his throat, suddenly feeling the weight of the moment. 6 months ago, he began, his voice strong and clear, an incident occurred in this courtroom that opened our eyes to the shortcomings in our system. Today, we gather not to dwell on past mistakes, but to celebrate the steps we've taken to ensure that such an incident never happens again. He went on to outline the changes that had been implemented. Every courtroom was now equipped with video remote interpreting services for ASL and other languages. Court staff had undergone extensive training on disability awareness and accommodation. The police department had instituted new protocols for interacting with deaf individuals and those with other disabilities. But perhaps the most significant change, Judge Hawthorne continued, has been in our attitude. We've learned that true justice can only be served when we recognize and respect the diversity of our community. As he spoke, he saw nods of agreement throughout the room. He caught the eye of Officer James Rodriguez, who had been instrumental in implementing changes within the police force. The officer gave a small nod of acknowledgement, We have a special guest with us today, Judge Hawthorne said, his voice softening. Amara Johnson, would you please join me up here? There was a rustle of movement as Amara made her way to the front of the courtroom. As she climbed the steps to stand beside him, Judge Hawthorne was struck by the confidence in her bearing. Such a contrast to the frightened girl he'd encountered 6 months ago. An ASL interpreter took her place next to Amara, ready to translate. Judge Hawthorne turned to face the young girl directly. Amara, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I want to thank you. Your courage in the face of adversity, your willingness to educate us and work with us, it's made all of this possible. You've taught us more than any textbook or training session ever could. As the interpreter signed his words, Amara's eyes welled with tears. When it was her turn to speak, her hands moved with grace and passion, the interpreter's voice carrying her words to the rapt audience. Thank you, Judge Hawthorne, Amara signed. What happened that day was scary and hurtful, but seeing how everyone has worked to make changes, to understand and include people like me, it gives me hope. It makes me proud to be part of this community. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom as Amara finished speaking. Judge Hawthorne felt a lump in his own throat as he turned back to address the room. Let this be a new beginning for all of us, he said. Commitment to continual learning, to openness, to ensuring that our justice system truly serves all members of our community. As the ceremony concluded, the courtroom buzzed with energy. People mingled, chatting and signing, barriers that had once seemed insurmountable now falling away. Judge Hawthorne watched as Officer Rodriguez approached Amara and her family, his hands moving in careful ASL as he introduced himself. Sarah Chen appeared at the judge's elbow. Quite a transformation, isn't it? She said, eyes scanning the room. Judge Hawthorne nodded. It is, but we can't become complacent. There's still so much work to be done. Sarah smiled. True, but look around, Judge. This is what progress looks like. This is what happens when we're willing to learn from our mistakes and commit to doing better. As the crowd began to disperse, Judge Hawthorne made his way over to where Amara stood with her family. He waited patiently as she finished a conversation with a group of deaf students who had attended the ceremony. When she turned to him, he took a deep breath and began to sign. Slowly and carefully, using the ASL he'd been studying diligently over the past months. Thank you, Amara, he signed. You've taught me so much. Amara's face lit up with a brilliant smile. She signed back, her movements slowed to match his pace. Thank you for listening and learning. It means everything. As Judge Hawthorne left the courthouse that evening, he paused on the steps, looking out over the town square. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, a fitting end to a momentous day. He thought about how much had changed in 6 short months. A misunderstanding that could have ended in tragedy had instead become a catalyst for profound and lasting change. It hadn't been easy. There had been resistance, setbacks, moments of doubt, but standing here now, seeing the fruits of their collective efforts, he knew it had all been worth it. The incident with Amara had opened his eyes to the biases and shortcomings in the system he'd served for so long. But more than that, it had reminded him of why he'd become a judge in the first place: to serve justice, protect the vulnerable, to make a positive difference in his community. As he descended the courthouse steps, Judge William Hawthorne felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But for the first time in years, he felt truly excited about the future of justice in Millbrook County. The image of Amara's smiling face stayed with him as he walked to his car. Courage, her forgiveness, her willingness to help them learn and grow. It was a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the positive change that was possible when people came together with open hearts and minds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth and learning. But tonight, as the first stars began to twinkle in the twilight sky, Judge Hawthorne allowed himself to feel a sense of accomplishment, hope, and of deep gratitude for unexpected lessons that had reshaped his world. In the end, what had started with a misunderstanding, a judge seeing a young black girl making strange hand signals, had blossomed into something beautiful. Community coming together, learning, growing, and committing to a more just and inclusive future for all its members. And that, Judge Hawthorne reflected as he drove home under the starry sky, was the truest form of justice. Imagine